All right. I believe the recording has started, so I'll start a lecture about robust case building. My name is Sunghyun. I'm one of the CAP members of this semester's KNC. I hope this helps people preparing for KNC. So the contents are as follows. I'll cover pretty much many things. I'll try to be as brief and as compact as possible. The first thing I'm going to talk about would be case building mindset and what you should take into consideration when you build cases. And then I'm going to talk about identifying burdens, how you can identify burdens to the extent that you can make your argument more resilient. Then I'm going to talk about what being comparative means and how you can build a comparative analysis. Then I'm going to talk about some skills and techniques that you can use in order to make your case stronger. Things like framing, impacting, and weighing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about prep time strategy, and then the team dynamics. And then I'm going to talk about first speaker tips and what type of mindset you should have in terms of first speaker, because I usually do first speaker in AP debates. So what are the things that you have to take into consideration when you case build? So basically, I do believe that prep time and case building is just the most important thing for winning the debate. I do believe that 80% of the win and loss will be determined during prep time when you build your cases. So having a winning mindset during case building and prep will be the most certain and important pathway for victory. So I do believe that it is preferable that your case both has positive and negative elements. What I mean by positive and negative elements is, for positive elements, you're basically proving your own case and proving why your side is better. And I think you will encounter some cases where, for example, judges say that, oh, your side didn't have enough positive mechanism. This basically kind of points out that you didn't build your own case. So for example, you are able to prove that bad things happen under your opponent's side, but you don't necessarily explain why those bad things do not happen under your side, or why good things happen under your side, which is the positive elements of your case. In terms of negative elements, probably you're just disproving opponent's case, why their side is worse, why bad things are going to happen under the opponent's side. So I believe that these two opponents should coexist in your case. Only focusing on one element of your case would probably result in your case being uncomparative and being more vulnerable to your opponent responses. And the second thing is envisioning specific strategies is extremely, extremely important and necessary. So for example, how can you ensure that your case stands, or how to make it more resilient to potential opponent engagements? So this basically means how you can just make your argument or your case stand till the end of the round, even though your opponent makes some attempts to respond or demolish your case. So I think it is very important to, for example, make some preemptive attempts to ensure that your case becomes more resilient to your opponent's engagement attempts. Also, you can also think of the negative strategy as well, to how you can respond to potential main case of the opponents. So I think especially in AP debates, it is pretty obvious what case your opponents would run in many of the cases. You will be able to think about some potential arguments of your opponents. And there will be some obvious ones, even if you cannot anticipate every single one of your opponent arguments. At least if you are able to identify what the main argument of their side would be, or what the most obvious argument of your opponent would be, at least you need to be prepared of that and try to think of responsive strategies of how you are going to make that opponent claim less important, less likely, or less relevant in the round. So there are many strategies that you can use. For example, you can mitigate your opponent case. For example, giving many reasons as to why certain things are like unlikely or less likely. Or you can completely neutralize their case, which is like a stronger version of mitigation. So basically mitigation still leaves some margin. So for example, even if you try to mitigate, and even if you are successful in mitigating your opponent case, that case still remains to some extent. It's just that you decrease the margin of that argument. Whereas neutralizing basically means that you just demolish that margin. I think flip goes one step further and explaining why you actually have a certain argument, certain impact better under your side. So for example, if opposition wants to claim X impact under their side, if you want to flip that argument from government side, you want to prove that X impact happens better under your side, then probably you can just like co-opt and take that argument coming from the opposition side and claim that as your impact, which is one of the most strongest strategies, but at the same time, it is hardest. Or in the end, you can also make some weighing attempts to, for example, even if you are unable to completely demolish or flip the argument from your opponent's side, so therefore, even if some margin remains under the opponent case, why your arguments are more important, that is what weighing tries to do, to answer the question of why your argument needs to deserve more consideration in the debate in comparison to any other opponent claims. So I think this is especially important in AP, especially unlike BP, where you can kind of like frame out your opponent or other side quite conveniently. I still think that in AP, when there is only one opponent and we are just going to do ping pong until the end of the round, then probably I think more active attempts of engagement is necessary. I think there are other lectures that cover weighing and rebuttals. I'm not going to cover that robustly in this lecture. Just keep in mind that you also need to think of the responsive strategy while you build your case. So what is the logical structure of your arguments? I think this is very simple and very basic, but most of the times debaters kind of miss this, even if they are pretty seasoned debaters. I see many cases where debaters don't have a robust logical structure of arguments, which basically means that some crucial components of their arguments are missing, and it makes their argument much more vulnerable to opponent responses. The first thing, and the most like kind of like disregarded or neglected components of an argument is the thesis, which is the title of your arguments. And I see a lot of cases where debaters kind of only label their argument as, my first argument would be about principle. My second argument would be about practical. But if you actually think about it, principle and practical, those like words do not indicate anything, do not indicate what burden you should prove in the round, or what is the argument that you want to prove in the round. It just explains that you're going to talk about principle and practical without explaining what principle or what practical you are going to explain in the round. So I would suggest that when you're making, for example, a principle claim, don't only say that, oh, I'm going to prove the principle, because that is very vague and like ambiguous. Rather, I think it is much better that you explain, for example, why X fundamentally constrains women's agency and how supporting this contradicts the principle of feminism. And then judges and also your opponents are now able to identify what principle you are talking about and why that principle is harmed because of certain motion. Or even if you want to talk about some practical arguments, don't just talk about practical or effectiveness. specifically explain why X policy uniquely leads to the exclusion of Y minorities if your practical argument tackles minorities. So my endpoint here is try to be as specific and concise as possible when you are trying to deliver the thesis of your arguments. The reason why I'm saying this is not just because of the clarity of that argument for the sake of like judges, but also just setting a clear this thesis in your argument also helps you identify specific burdens that are required in a specific argument. This leads to the second component of the argument, which is mechanism. When you are trying to prove a mechanism, you're basically trying to prove why this argument or why this thesis is true. So I think, like, for example, why this leads to the exclusion of Y minorities, why this contradicts principle of feminism, all those things constitutes the part of mechanism. But I think how you mechanize and to what extent you need to mechanize a certain point depends on the nature of your thesis. So, for example, your thesis, when your thesis is more about like principle, then you first explain why a certain principle stands. For example, why feminism should care about certain type of principles. And then you need to explain as to why certain action that the feminism take in certain motion is going to specifically harm the principle at the end. Or if you want to talk about the exclusion of Y minorities, then the first thing you need to explain is to why this obviously leads to the exclusion of Y minorities, why certain policy leads to the exclusion. But also at the same time, you need to explain as to why this exclusion of minority doesn't happen or happens significantly less under the opponent's side to ensure that you prove the margin of the degree of exclusion of Y minorities. If your opponent is able to claim, for example, that Y minorities are anyway going to be excluded under either side of the house because of XYZ reasons, then it becomes very ambiguous to what extent these minorities are going to be more marginalized specifically because of this X policy. Without that analysis, probably, yeah, we do care about Y minorities, but we don't know why these minorities are just worse off because of this policy. Then this argument about minority exclusion becomes very irrelevant because you cannot prove the margin in the round. So therefore, burden identification becomes extremely, extremely important to make your mechanism more resilient, which means that you are more immune to your opponent responses. The last part is impacting, to basically explain why this argument is important, why we should care about this argument at the end. And I think often in the end of the debate, weighing is needed. Weighing basically means impacting with the comparative elements. So for example, you not only explain as to why this argument is important and why we should care about this argument in vacuum, but rather you are trying to actively compare your argument to your opponent argument to explain why this argument deserves more attention and more consideration in the debate in comparison to your opponent's argument. So even if their argument still stands, our argument is more important, and that's why your side is more superior, right? So firstly, I want to talk about identifying burdens. I will focus on burdens about mechanism, and I would just want to flag out that burdens doesn't only exist in mechanism part of the argument, but it also is required in impacting part. And I feel like many debaters are pretty good at doing impacting. I think more important consideration in burden identification probably would be about mechanisms. So I would more focus on this part. So basically, burden means the sub-claims you need to prove in order to prove your entire argument / entire thesis. So in the debate, for example, Nisas believes that the feminism movement should publicly condone female politicians who support far-right policies and your government side. And when your argument and your thesis is that this condonement will lead to more support for feminism movement. And if that is your thesis, then probably the burdens would be as follows. The first thing to prove is who are the ones that will support feminism due to this motion. So you want to identify certain stakeholders and characterize these stakeholders and why these stakeholders would be more persuaded by feminism movement when the feminism movement condoned these female politicians. And then you can also explain why would these people not support feminism absent this motion? Because if opposition, for example, is able to just prove that, oh, but yeah, these stakeholders will still support feminism even without this particular motion, then probably you cannot prove any margin, which means that in order for you to make sure that you can claim this margin about certain stakeholders, then you also need to explain why these people would not support feminism without this motion, which means that you can prove the uniqueness of your argument and exclusivity of your arguments. The next thing, obviously, you should prove is why would other stakeholders not stop supporting feminism? Because I think opposition obviously will say that, oh, like, but many women who initially supported feminism would be pissed off by this motion, and therefore you would have less support for feminism. Then I think it is very strategic that you preemptively explain why other stakeholders will still support feminism, or why vast majority of the initial supporters will still stay within the feminist movement. Or if you just go one step further and explain, even if other stakeholders stop supporting feminisms, why are the ones who will support feminism due to this motion more important in this debate? So this basically requires impacting and weighing elements. So for example, even if opposition proves that, for example, some women will be pissed off and therefore would leave the feminism movement, why are the stakeholders that you want to defend are more important in comparison to these stakeholders? If you're able to prove this, then probably even if you cannot completely demolish opposition argument about some people being pissed off and therefore leaving the feminism movement, that doesn't matter. Like, it matters less than the increase of the support for the feminism movement due to this motion from the type of stakeholders that you want to talk about. So this will make your argument much more resilient and more relevant in the rounds. Then my question is, how can you find burden? Because I think in many cases, debaters kind of like struggle in finding burdens to make sure that their argument is more resilient. I think the most important and convenient way is to ask yourself where you will be challenged, what part of your argument is most vulnerable to be challenged. So if you are able to just think of, for example, potential rebuttals or responses that might come from your opponent's side, then probably you can build upon that more preemptively to make sure that it becomes harder for your opponent's side to just respond to your arguments, right? So if you're able to preemptively prove that burden, then probably it increases the burden of your opponent's side to respond to your argument, because they need to respond to all of the preemptive material that you have presented previously. The second thing is about setting concrete thesis and bottom line. As I have explained in the previous part, setting a concrete thesis and specific thesis will help you identify burdens. For example, if you want to run an argument that you can solve the problem of black market when you legalize things like drugs, it can be many other things, but I'll just give an example of drugs. Then you need to prove why majority of addicts will still consume drugs even if drugs are illegal, and why these drugs are going to be consumed in a much less safer and more dangerous manner in comparison to a regulated market, which will happen under your side of the house, right? So if you actually look at this, and if you are able to identify the burden, you can just see that you need to prove that a majority of addicts, not just like some portion of addicts, but majority of addicts will still consume drugs regardless of legalization. And then you secondly need to prove that why in comparative black market is much more dangerous in comparison to a regulated market, right? So if you are able to identify these specific words like majority of addicts or less safer manner, then probably this specifically requires you to explain, for example, why a vast majority of addicts, not just small portion of addicts, will still consume, but at the same time, why this legalized market is going to be much safer in comparison to the black market. So for example, you're not only explaining why black market is so dangerous, but at the same time, you are putting a comparative element in that argument and to explain as to why legalized market would be much safer than the black market that will exist under the opposition paradigm. This also leads to my second advice for finding burden, which is to be more comparative. So for example, if you want to claim a certain impact, then you need to explain why certain impact only exists under your side of the house. Then your burden is not only to explain why certain impact happens under your side, but also at the same time, you need to explain why that impact happens less or why that impact doesn't happen under your side. So if that like comparative element doesn't exist, then it becomes more vulnerable to your opponent responses because your opponent can simply say that, oh, like we also have that impact. Oh, we can also claim that impact, right? If that is the case, then probably you cannot prove the margin. So you need to actively try to prove as to why certain arguments or certain impacts will only exist under your side, or why that impact will exist more under your side on a scale. The last thing will be about prioritizing burdens. So obviously, different arguments will require different burdens, and different burdens will require different degree of fulfillment in terms of that burden. So I think, for example, certain points might not need that much analysis to be proven, whereas certain points will need much, much more analysis to be proven because it just requires more analytical work. Then I think the standard that you can rely on when prioritizing burdens is to prioritize burden that will be more contested, will be more responded by your opponent's side. And I think this is basically called preemption, right? So because your opponent will respond to your argument in this respect, then you need to strengthen your argument preemptively to make sure that it becomes harder for your opponent to just conveniently respond to your arguments. So if certain parts of your argument is not really going to be contested, then when both sides is just going to agree with certain points, then you don't really need to use that much time in explaining that because your opponent will obviously not respond to that. In that case, I think it is much more strategic that you prioritize using time on more controversial and contested matter, because that is what will make you win the rounds. All right, then I'll start explaining comparative. So I first want to explain why being comparative is important. I think I touched upon this issue a little bit, but you need to be comparative. So like the example here is this sauce prefers sushi to 정시. If you're unfamiliar with these two concepts, these two are different ways of university admission in Korea. So sushi basically means that you make a holistic admission based on your school record. Based on your school record and like different consideration that the university choose to take into account. In comparison to that, 정시 basically means a one standardized test, which is KSAT, will be the one and only factor for deciding the accept whether or not certain student is going to be accepted. So when the government wants to say that, oh, KSAT encourages private education because blah, 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 blah. But if opposition is able to just like respond by saying that, but like sushi also encourages private education, then the question here is who promotes more private education? Because under either side, it is believable that private education will exist to some extent. Then people need to prove as to why under their side they at least have less degree of private education. That's why comparative analysis is important, because if you are unable to prove the comparative in terms of the degree of private education, then you cannot prove the margin in today's debate. And that's why it is important to prove an asymmetry in the round, which is basically saying that you need to prove comparative if you want to prove the margin in the round. The next thing is like governments, if they runs the argument that KSAT encourages private education, but when the opposition wants to say that, oh, but like sushi makes students tired, then in the judge's perspective, it is very confusing because that is not the actual response to the argument that government has made, because I'm kind of like confused as to why I do have to care about students being tired, especially when we are talking about private education. So I'm like, so what? So probably both is true, because Gov has proven that KSAT encourages private education, and opposition was able to prove that sushi makes students tired. Then in this case, probably these two things are both true, but there is no standard that has been provided by any of the teams to like kind of like judge the debate, judge what like argument is more important in terms of like being considered in the round. So comparative analysis is actually important for actual engagement, because as I have just explained, this opposition response in the second example is not on actual response, right? Because you are not engaging into the idea of encouraging private education, but rather you are bringing another idea about making students tired. So if you want to actually engage upon the idea of private education, you need to make a response based on that same metric of encouraging private education. If not, you're kind of like making a false response unless you are making a direct weighing or framing attempt to ensure that other aspects of this debate is more important than encouraging private education. Also, I want to point out that comparative is a mindset. So I think if you just keep this particular mindset of trying to be comparative, I think the quality of argument will significantly increase. So if you want to explain something is going to happen under your side, you always need to explain why that is not or less going to happen under their side of the house. So I think it is also advisable that you try to use comparative wording. So I know this is just an issue about wording, but that wording actually has a lot of impact in changing your mindset. So for example, you are trying to name your argument or thesis not in an absolute. So for example, this happens, but rather you're going to see that this happens more under your side, then probably you can put a more comparative element in your arguments if you actively attempt to like label your argument with these comparative wordings. Also, I want to point out here that direct comparison is extremely, extremely crucial. Direct comparison means that you have to stick to the same criteria / metric. As I had explained in this second example about like false response, this happens because you don't engage into the same metric. If you have to claim a certain comparative, then you need to stick to one specific criteria, one specific metric. For example, when you want to talk about encouragement of private education, then you need to explain why private education happens under your side and why that happens less under their side, not bringing in different criteria that will be irrelevant for that particular argument. Then what is a direct comparison? So basically, you are using the same metric to explain why something happens more or less under your side of the house. So for example, in the motion about this house believes that the feminism movement should support the narrative that beauty doesn't matter over the narrative that all bodies are beautiful. And if you are opposition, and therefore you want to prove that all bodies are beautiful narrative, is something that should be supported by feminism movement in comparison to the beauty doesn't matter narrative. And then your argument is, which narrative is more compelling? So you want to prove the idea of persuasiveness. So the big metric here is about the persuasiveness of the two narratives. And then you are trying to introduce different sub-metric and sub-standards for persuasiveness. So I'm going to explain these 4 subclaims and explaining in order to explain why all bodies are beautiful narrative is more persuasive. The first thing is our belief. So basically, beauty doesn't matter. It's not believable because we already value beauty. We already have belief that values beauty. For example, we all have our own aesthetic preferences. We all value things like art and music. We also feel sexual attraction to, for example, people who look more attractive. In comparison to that, all bodies are beautiful narratives are more believable because we easily believe that because our evaluation of beauty is actually subjective. For example, everybody has a different perception of what type you have, what type of person you are more attracted to, or what type of like beauty that you want to opt into, or just like what standard you want to have in terms of certain beauty. And that's why, because already people have different standard or different beliefs in what constitutes beauty, that's why people are going to be able to believe in the narrative that all bodies are beautiful in comparison to beauty doesn't matter because people already think that beauty does matter. The second thing is about our experience. Our experience is more compatible to this beauty doesn't matter narrative because in beauty doesn't matter, we cannot believe that because our lived experience has proved that our appearance does impact our lives. Because, for example, some might have an experience of being bullied by other people because they look ugly, or they get deprioritized in, for example, dating apps, or just like being rejected by a person that you like because that person doesn't think that you are attractive enough. In comparison to that, in terms of all bodies are beautiful narrative, people can believe that because people have their own experiences where they feel like they are beautiful. For example, in their wedding day or in your like promotion, like when you kind of like get a very good makeup or stuff. So basically these type of like special stories or specific occasions in which you feel that you are beautiful enough. So basically you still have the experience of feeling yourself as a beautiful person. And that's why it's more believable because we also have our lived experience of us also being considered as a beautiful person. The third thing would be about susceptibility, to what extent you are susceptible to certain narratives. For example, in beauty doesn't matter, we don't want to believe this because this would take away meaning from the times we felt pretty. So we are not really susceptible or more open to accept this particular narrative because we actually have some experiences, as I've explained, things like wedding occasions and stuff, where we did feel pretty and we did feel happy because we are pretty. Then in that particular case, it is very unlikely that people will be able to believe that beauty doesn't matter because and that's why we are less susceptible. In comparison to that, all of us want to feel that we can be pretty, we deserve to be beautiful. So in terms of that, because this aligns more with our desire to feel beautiful, then probably it is more likely that we are susceptible to this particular narrative than the narrative that beauty doesn't matter. The last metric would be about corporations and why corporations would be more buying into the narrative of all bodies are beautiful. For example, the beauty industry will fight back against the narrative that beauty doesn't matter, because that kind of like completely demolishes the reason for them to exist at the first place. Because if beauty doesn't matter at all, there is no necessity for people to, for example, buy any beauty products. And that's why corporations are going to massively backlash. Whereas if you want to promote the narrative that all bodies are beautiful, then probably I think corporation would have the incentive to align themselves with this narrative. And for example, provide more beauty products that fits into, for example, oversized individuals or people in people of like color, to make sure that these people can also access certain cosmetic products, because all bodies can potentially be beautiful as well. So the conclusion here is that even in one criterion about persuasiveness, there can be different sub-criteria, different sub-metric, and you should make a direct match upon each of the sub-criteria. So I think it would be much more strategic and much more effective to prove a certain point, to establish different sub-criteria and explaining why each of the sub-criteria is in favor of your side. Then you have multiple analysis to prove that you have better persuasiveness, for example, in this argument. So that's why your argument just has much more robustness in comparison to you just like bluntly explaining why persuasiveness happens more under your side, and you just like mix up everything, and that makes it much more ambiguous to what extent you're being comparative. But I just want to point here out that you don't need to be comparative in every single occasion, even though being comparative is necessary in some parts of argumentation. You need to be comparative to prove the trade-off. This means that, for example, when you're trying to explain that some stakeholders are more like A than the others. So if you want to characterize a certain stakeholders that these people are going to act or think in a certain direction more than the other type of stakeholders, then you need to make a direct comparison about these stakeholders and the other stakeholders to explain what type of characteristic these people have, to the extent that these people would not take action in certain direction. Or you can also, if you want to prove that A impact is more likely to happen under your side, as I've explained, you also need to explain why that doesn't happen or happen less under their side of the house. But there are certain occasions in which you don't need to be comparative. So it's basically when you don't need to prove a trade-off, right? So for example, in this house regrets, this house opposes, or any type of debate that requires counterfactual, then you need to prove why certain counterfactual is just likely. You don't need to necessarily prove that, oh, something is more likely than one another. If you are sufficiently able to prove that this particular counterfactual is likely to happen absent certain narrative or absent certain consent, then probably you can still prove that this counterfactual is the likely counterfactual. But obviously, if your opponent tries to suggest that different counterfactual is going to exist, then probably it is also your burden to explain why your version of counterfactual is more likely than the other side's counterfactual. So it depends on the scenario. The second thing is about like mitigation and symmetricization strategy, which is to basically prove as to why certain thing happens under both sides. So in that particular case, if your opponent wants to say that, oh, like something happens only under their side of the house, then your strategy is simply to prove that, oh, but it also happens under our side. Then you don't need a comparative element. You just need to prove that this also happens under your side because of other type of reasons. Then in that case, I think you can mitigate the degree of your argumentation, the opponent's argumentation, and that's why you don't need a comparative element. The last thing is about principal arguments, because oftentimes principles are kind of like absolute. So you need to explain the standards for the principle, and then explain why certain scenario and certain occasions is going to fit into the standard of that particular principle. If that standard has been fulfilled, then probably that principle is also being fulfilled. So yeah, you don't need a comparative element to prove that certain principle is going to be fulfilled or not fulfilled. The next thing I want to talk about is the tipping point. So tipping point is also an important element for building certain mechanism, because you want to prove that something will happen specifically because of this motion. This is strictly kind of tightly related to the comparative elements. because this tipping point analysis is going to strengthen the comparative element of your arguments, because you are trying to directly link this particular motion to a specific impact. Why this particular motion is going to be the specific tipping point for a certain impact to be materialized. This is important because you are preempting the attempt to symmetricize, because obviously your opponent will try to explain as to why certain impacts are going to happen anyway under their side anyways. And then if you are able to preemptively prove that this specifically happens only because of this motion, then probably opposition cannot really conveniently give a response that, oh, like, but there are other reasons why this happens, right? So in order to prove the margin, I think you need to prove the tipping point. And I think I have already explained many things to explain the tipping point analysis. So I'll just like skip the example because of time constraints. So this is a tipping point rebuttal. So basically you are trying to explain as to why this is not a tipping point. So probably this motion is not a tipping point for certain things to happen. Then you want to explain that, oh, like there are other reasons independent from this motion that will lead to a same impact that government wants to claim. If you're able to prove that as opposition, then you are making a good tipping point rebuttal. But I think this has been covered by Yeon-Soo when she talked about rebuttals, so I'm going to skip this as well. The next thing I want to talk about is about the framing. So I just want to kind of like confess that I honestly don't know what framing is about, but my philosophy of what framing is to prove the relevance of each of the claims. So for example, why certain stakeholders are less relevant in today's debate, or why certain context is relevant in the debate. So if you're able to prove this, then probably when you are like basically able to prove that certain stakeholders that your opponent's side want to focus on is less relevant in the rounds, then probably the stakeholders that you want to talk about is going to be a more relevant stakeholders in the round, which means that you just have more significance in the debate. But I just want to flag that this strategy of framing can be used in AP and is encouraged to use in AP. But I want to advise you that it's better that you refrain from solely rely on certain framing, because if teams operate on a different framework, judges would have to arbitrarily decide what framing is more persuasive for them. And I think that is a bit risky because it leaves the judges to decide on their own. It is out of control of the debaters. So as a debater who wants to increase the certainty that you are going to win the round, then probably you also need to make more attempts to actively engage into your opponent's framework rather than kind of like being dismissive and saying that this is our framework and our framework is different from the opponent's side. That is going to seem less engaging. So what are the framings that you can use? The first framing is the middle ground and gray area framing. For example, politics motions, you want to argue that the most important stakeholders are the swing voters who might change, who doesn't have like a strong preference. These people are going to be the most susceptible voters by any of the messaging coming from the political parties. And that's why if we are able to prove that these swing voters are going to be more persuaded under our side of the house, then probably we can prove the most relevant margin in the round. Or you can also talk about the middle ground mindset, like for example, like in certain social movement motions about like feminism, environment, or like LGBT, I don't know. You can prove that people who do not have strong opinion about these certain agendas are going to be the ones who are more susceptible to certain messaging. So therefore, we have to more focus on these people. The same thing also happens in the religion debates when you want to more focus on the moderate believers and seeing that these moderate believers are the ones who are going to be most impacted by this motion, and therefore these people ought to be prioritized. The second thing is about likely context framing. So when you are trying to specifically explain what type of context is the most relevant context in the round, what context is going to be what context is like the most relevant, because like this motion is gonna have the most impact in certain specific context. So for example, in the motion, this also supports charter cities. Basically, charter city is like a city that has been that it's the city that is governed by certain private corporations, not necessarily private entities. So for example, the government is gonna auction certain cities to just give the power and authority to govern certain cities to the corporation. So if you're government side and if you want to preempt the argument coming from opposition that this is going to lack accountability from corporations because they are not prone to things like elections or whatnot, then probably you need to firstly explain that the case in which charter cities actually happens at the first place is probably going to be a city where public entities, for example, the federal or local governments, are very, very unsuccessful in ruling this particular city. Because if this city is kind of like functioning very well, there is no reason for the government to just sell the city, right? So in that case, it is irrelevant. So in order for this charter city to actually happen at the first place, it is very likely that the public entities has failed in taking enough care for these cities. So this is the first context that you want to launch. The second context that you can also talk about is, for example, what are the type of corporations who are going to buy these type of cities? In government, you can say that it is probably going to be the very big companies like multinational corporations who probably have a lot of money to invest in things like public infrastructure or things like hospital, schools, or building housing, or building a lot of factories. So in order for you to have that much of a capital to, like initial capital to just invest in these areas to that large of an extent, probably it is very likely that the biggest corporations like the MNCs are going to be the ones who are going to have enough capacity to buy these cities at the first place. This is important because you can explain as to why these multinational corporations are more prone to international scrutiny or scrutiny coming from other competing corporations, which is going to check and balance certain toxic actions that might potentially happen in these charter cities. So by launching these two contexts, you already can preempt many arguments coming from the opposition side to a large extent. The last framing that you can talk about is the likely action framing. This happens in a lot of movement rounds. So for example, this also believes that the feminism movement should celebrate the consumption and creation of pornography by women. And if you are the government side, like you can kind of like frame this by saying that feminism movement is like prioritizing women liberation, and they do prioritize the right of women. And that's why it is very, very unlikely that they are going to celebrate the specific pornography that is very, very derogatory and violent to women, but rather it's very likely that these feminist movements are going to give more focus and spotlight on certain type of pornography that, for example, specifically talks about the sexual desire of women, or kind of like talks about healthy type of sexual intercourse that you can have and things like that. So obviously it is going to be squirreling the motion if you say that feminism movement will only talk about these pornographies. But I think it is fair that the feminism movement will use their limited capital and prioritize the allocation of capital in celebrating the specific type of pornography that empowers women rather than the pornography that's going to be very violent or derogatory towards women, because that is actively against the interest of women's rights. If you're able to frame this in this way, then probably you can also significantly preempt the argumentation coming from the opposition side by saying that, like, oh, but like pornography is violent, pornography is already coercive to women, and that's why we shouldn't celebrate this. What is impacting? So basically, So basically impacting is to prove why we have to care about this particular argument, why this is important, so that we ought to give consideration to this particular piece of arguments. And I want to flag here that different arguments call for a different degree of impacting. So there are certain arguments that obviously seem to be important, whereas there are also arguments that seem to be less important intuitively. So in that case, you need to make much more attempts to explain why we ought to care about this, even though it seems intuitively less important. So for example, arguments like stopping war, saving more lives, or alleviating poverty, all these things seem very, very important and impactful. So you don't need to use much time explaining why, for example, stopping war is important, because everyone would probably agree upon that. Whereas things like social messaging, or things like good and bad optics for, I don't know, certain political party or social movement, or like the expansion of artistic expression, all these things look a little bit less intuitively important in comparison to impacts like stopping war, saving more lives and stuff. In that case, I think you need to use a lot of time to explain as to why we should care about this and why this indeed is an important consideration in the debate, because otherwise it is very likely that judges are going to deprioritize these arguments in comparison to more intuitively important arguments. But I just want to also point out that impacting doesn't automatically make you win the round. So even if you are successful in proving that certain argument is important, you didn't actually prove why this argument is more important than the opponent's arguments. So you need to explain why your argument deserves more consideration in the round in comparison to other argument coming from your opponent's side. But there are also other occasions where impacting is not the sole factor for deciding the win for the round. So for example, some arguments can be not that much likely, but at the same time, it is important. So the probability that this particular impact materializes, for example, I don't know, 20%, but the importance of this is like 80 points out of like 100 points. Then even though it is important, it might be unlikely. But that doesn't mean that it automatically loses the round. It's just that you need to take into consideration different different components of the argument, which is the likelihood, the importance, or the relevance. Some arguments can be small scale, but at the same time, it can be very important. So it only tackles a small subset of people, but you can also explain as to why these people are important. So basically, comparison between different arguments should be made, and judges are going to have to judge the debate based on different components of the argument and how, holistically speaking, these components of argument interact with each other, and therefore what is the more like significant argument that deserves more consideration in the round, considering every single aspect of the argument, things like the likelihood or the importance and the relevance. This has been covered by Yo's judging lecture. So if you are interested in this aspect, I think you can take a look more on that judging lecture. Even if you're debating, I think watching the judge lecture is also going to help you a lot. The last thing I want to talk about is weighing, but I don't want to talk a lot about weighing because there is another lecture that will cover weighing. But I want to just flag out that weighing is an impacting with comparative elements, because impacting only proves why certain argument is important, whereas weighing is proving why this is more important than one another. And I would also point out that weighing is very, very crucial in debates, because it is going to allow you to do more charitable engagement, which is to say that even if you buy their impact, even if you assume their argument to be true, why is our argument more important than their side's arguments? This is the question that weighing can answer, And that's why this is extremely, extremely useful in breaking deadlocks. So I think, yeah, that's kind of like how you can make a more stronger engagement. So if you have on occasion, if you have many experiences of like debating ending up like, oh, like this clash ends up as a deadlock, other clash also ends up as a deadlock. I think it often happens because of lack of weighing. So if you are able to do that, I think you will have a much better upper hand in winning the rounds. Then I want to talk about team dynamics. I think this is going to be more about the specific tips that you can actually use during tournaments. So for example, you need to first identify the strengths and the weaknesses of each of the speakers in your team, because obviously it is ideal that first speaker do pretty much everything to make sure that the latter speakers can more focus on the responsive stuff. But oftentimes it is impossible because of time constraints, because of skill constraints, like all of those like issues, right? I also cannot do every single thing. So what I do is to look at what my partners are good at and what I am good at in comparison to my partners and trying to focus on my strength. For example, if I am better at mechanizing stuff, I'm gonna more focus on the mechanisms rather than things like impacting and weighing, because that can be done in my ladder speakers as well. So you can identify strength in things like actual analysis building, which is mechanism, or things like characterization, or impacting or framing, or rebuttal and engagement. So if your partner is good at impacting and framing, then you don't have to do that much in impacting and framing if you're not really good at it. Rather, it is better that you focus on what you're good at so that your partner can focus on what they are better at. So yeah. So I think you can kind of like divide the labor among your own team and trying to focus on these things so that more optimization of your speaking time can happen. Also, specific motions can require specific analyses. For example, is it intuitive enough to visualize what the motion is about? Things like narrative debates or things like this house prefers a world debate. It requires a lot of analytical work to explain how a certain world is going to look like, or how this certain narrative is going to manifest in the real world. I think these type of things should be done in first speaker to just make sure that your argument stands, because the way in which certain narrative manifests is going to be the crucial underlying premise for any of your argument to stand, which means that first speaker, if you're a first speaker in a narrative debate, you should use enough time to actually explain how visually it will look like in a certain scenario, or how this narrative is gonna like manifest in real world. Or does motion seem to like cover like diverse areas, like many different like areas, many different arguments that can be generated? In this case, you have to decide what argument you want to more focus on, or what argument you are going to focus on as the first speaker. So for example, if I were the first speaker, I would more focus on certain arguments that requires more explanation, that requires more time to explain, so that your deputy speakers can just focus on more simpler arguments. Then they can use more time on things like rebuttals, impacting, weighing, framing. Or does one side seem more intuitive than one another? Then probably, I know this is kind of like subjective, but like if you encounter a situation where your side kind of like seems to be less intuitive, then probably I think you need to also use a lot of time in, for example, preempting certain argumentation coming from your opponent's side to make sure that your argument stands. And then the preemption should still happen from the first speaker, because preemption can impose much higher burden to your opponent's side. So in order to make sure that your opponent's side uses more time in responding to your preemption, I think it's more strategic that you launch that preemption in your first speaker so that your opponent would be in trouble. So from now on, I'm going to briefly talk about Prime Minister role for about like 10 minutes. first thing to understand is that you are the first person to set up the debate and introduce your argument. This is very, very important because in many cases, like because you have prepped the motion for like 30 minutes, you are already familiar with what the motion looks like, what this motion is about. But in the perspective of the judges, it is very unlikely that they will feel familiar with the motion, which means that you need to be extra clear in what you are talking about, what this motion is about. Because otherwise, you are talking about what you already understand, while the judges don't understand the context in which your argument is operating. So try to be extra clear, even if something seems obvious to you. Just double check if this will seem obvious to the judges who are more new to this motion. The second thing to note is you cannot directly respond to later speakers unless you're like leader of opposition, right? But even if you're leader of opposition, you cannot respond to the deputy speakers and whip speakers, which means that it is very important that you make your argument stay relevant, just stand in the round. So making sure that your argument is resilient enough is also important. And the way in which you can make your argument resilient is, for example, proving the tipping points or proving the comparative and stuff like that, right? The third thing is, if you drop important parts of your arguments, it burdens your partners. So you should be doing the most time-consuming labor. So maybe you can skip some miscellaneous responses. But for example, if you miss the analysis on counterfactual and regret motion, then it will significantly burden your partner and your deputy and whip speakers, because not only do they have to respond to all the opponent arguments, they also have to use 2 to 3 minutes to explain what counterfactual looks like. And that will significantly limit their ability to, firstly, sufficiently build the counterfactual, but also at the same time, it will also constrain them from giving sufficient responses. So you need to identify not just doing what you want to do, but rather you need to do what you are supposed to do, like what your other partners would not be able to do. And that's something you can only do. And that's why you need to more focus on this stuff, even if you don't feel comfortable with doing that. Yeah. So in the actual debate, probably as a prime minister, you won't have enough time. So like, even if you are in AP, you would have like 5 to 10 minutes to organize your speech. Sometimes it will be sufficient. Sometimes it wouldn't be enough. So what you have to do is 2 things. The first thing is to prioritize the important materials, like building counterfactual or doing analytical work that requires a lot of time. So if that's something that prime minister can only do, that is what you should focus on. And then some miscellaneous responses or things like preemption or things like impacting and weighing. These can be just tossed onto your partners. If you do that, you need to communicate with your partner, because your partner should also be prepared for what they should do because you didn't fulfill your job 100%. In that case, I think it is very important that you inform your partners that I won't be able to do this sufficiently. So you need to do that. And you can like write stuff down to your deputy speakers after your speech is done. The second thing is signposting and organization is extra important because of the reason that I have talked about, that you are the first person who are going to introduce your case. So my advice here is that take at least 1 to 2 minutes to organize your stuff, because just writing down everything till the very like start of your speech is not going to allow you to have enough time to have a clear organization and the structure of your speech. So in the first 2 minutes of your prep time, or while like you do speaker introduction and stuff, you need to make sure that you have a clear title and the conclusion of each argument and analysis to just make sure that you will be able to clearly deliver what your argument is about. The last thing is do take POIs, like firstly because KNC requires your POI rule. At the same time, I think it will give more time for your deputy to like kind of like anticipate what the opponent argument will be, and that will like clearly benefit them. But like if you truly believe that you cannot take POI because of time constraints, and when your opponents do not raise any POIs, then maybe you can skip POIs. The last thing I'm going to talk about is useful case building and prime minister drills. This is not only for prime minister, actually. Even if you are second and third speaker, doing a PM speech is extremely helpful. So what I advise you to do is firstly, search for a decent debate video that you can refer to. For example, things like UADC videos or Australs videos. There are a lot of videos on YouTube, or you can just look for other big open tournaments if you want to. And then pick one motion and then do 15-minute prep, not 30 minutes, because you're not going to communicate with your partners. You're not going to do veto, and you want you to be put in more time constraint scenarios so that you can be more comfortable in 30-minute prep in actual tournaments. So only do 15-minute prep, and then do your prime minister or leader of opposition speech, and then listen to the actual prime minister speech in that video and kind of like write it down, take notes, and kind of like identify what you could have worked on, and then repeat your prime minister speech. Like I did this for like 2 times, like repeating my speech. Like you can do whatever time you want. I would recommend you to do this like every day, especially when KNC is kind of like approaching, at least for 1 week. Like you can use like about an hour to do your own PM drill, right? So I think it doesn't take that much time, but it will absolutely help you to build a better case and just do a better speech. So I recommend that you do this drill specifically on the motions that you're not good at, like on the themes that you're not good at. For example, if you're not good at IR, then you can do IR. And then if you can watch a good PM speech about IR motions, then you can also get a lot of like advice and tips for that as well. Yep, I think this is end for my lecture. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you in KNC.